welcome everyone to today's Thursday talk. Really excited to have Katie Smith from Search for Common Ground and Kim Brody Hart, USAID. Today we're discussing a paper that Katie at Search for Common Ground just put out called Polarization, Social Cohesion, and Atrocities, Approaches for a Safer World. So I'll hand it to Katie to present the paper, some of the findings, hand it to Kim as our expert listener and sort of the USAID perspective. Then as always, we'll go to conversation, Q&A, discussion. Katie, it's really great to have you here. I'll start sharing the screen and hand the floor over to you.
Great, Adler. Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me on to speak about this exciting research. So like Sander mentioned, Search for Common Ground recently released a report called Polarization, Social Cohesion, and Atrocities, Approaches for a Safer World. I'm going to quickly walk through the report and its findings, and then I really look forward to hearing Kim's thoughts as our expert listener and then having questions from all of you. So to get started, I first wanted to set the scene of where this report comes in. We all are familiar with the historical commitments to atrocity prevention, the never again, the responsibilities to protect. And these commitments have done a really important job of bringing public attention and recognition to the point that there are things that can be done to prevent atrocities before they begin, that atrocities are not inevitable, and that governments and individuals have a responsibility to act. I think despite this recognition that things can be done, we find ourselves still in this place of how and when and with what political will. And I think also we all may still familiar with the analysis that atrocity, prevention work seems to only happen when atrocities are already underway. So at Search, we really approach this research wanting to tackle this problem head on and offer ways that governments and donors and practitioners can make progress in early action to prevent atrocities. So as Zander mentioned, I work for Search for Common Ground, which is the world's largest dedicated peacebuilding organization. And we work on the front lines of conflict in nearly 36 countries, many of which are considered high risk for atrocities. This report comes specifically out of our implementation experience, working to transform conflicts and build healthy, just, and safe societies in 10 countries that have been top 10 atrocity risk countries over the last decade. So you can see the countries listed on the slide here. I'll say them out loud: Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, Mali, Myanmar, Nigeria, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. So as you look at this list, you'll probably note that this paper examined various kinds of atrocity risk context. In some cases, atrocities were or are underway. In other cases, targeted violence of civilians was happening, and it was at risk of escalating into mass atrocity. So they're not all the same kind of atrocity risk, but they all were considered high risk in terms of, the kind of classification of, how should we be thinking about this or how should we be ready for this? Just another quick note for this research was that we recognize that some atrocities are not always linked to wider social dynamics. But for the purpose of this research, we did just consider places where these linkages do exist. And we analyzed the approaches used to address those risk factors. So this is where the origin of this report really began, was by asking the question, what dynamics and approaches affect the risk environment for atrocities? So just very, very quickly in terms of process, we reviewed program reports, conflict scans, evaluation, as well as reviewed the broader atrocity prevention literature and spoke with our colleagues and partners to understand how peacebuilding programs affected the risk environment for atrocities. So what we learned across those contexts and from the review was 4 main things about high atrocity. But the first is that conflicts are more likely to become violent and deadly in places with weak and declining social. So we already know that ongoing violent conflict is one of the largest prerequisite indicators for atrocities are much more likely when there is ongoing violent conflict already happening. But what we found was that the status of social cohesion is a factor that improves our ability to anticipate potential violence better. And so when we talk about social cohesion, what we're talking about is this kind of societal glue that allows people to kind of live and exist peacefully in the same kind of idea space, in the same social space, in the same, physical space. And so weakening bonds in society and the weakening of this glue is a much earlier sign of a problem than many of the atrocity risk factors that are included in assessment frameworks that are considered, these alarm bells for the need for atrocity prevention. So often I feel that like when you say something like this, like I mentioned, right, you get a lot of, well, that's great, noted, but let us know when, things, start catching on fire. So I really wanted to highlight this point because I think it challenges us to reconsider how we respond to these alerts and, that we can kind of start to appreciate that the relationships that people are having with each other and with the institutions around them are a really important consideration when we're looking at the choice to choose violence or the choice to involve yourself in kind of the kind of contribute to the atrocity risk environment. The second point was that increasing polarization indicates growing atrocity risks. So this may not be that surprising for all of you, as we know that polarization is a strong indicator of intergroup hostility. But to me, the really interesting part of this was that, we need to be thinking both about social and physical isolation along dividing lines as risk factors for atrocity. And so we know that, dehumanizing language and things like that are these risks of, kind of intergroup violence. But I also think looking at, what are the narratives that are supporting this? How are people considering that members of another group actually belong to the same social code as them? Or do they think that the rules don't necessarily apply? And these are things that we need to be thinking about, I think, in terms of, this earlier approach to what prevention looks like. The third was that trust and legitimacy matter in atrocity prevention. These are actually really important considerations. So, low levels of legitimacy in institutions can be a factor in violence on both sides. So, for instance, if, civilian population believes that their government is not legitimate, it can cause uprising and protests. And on the flip side, right, a government that knows it doesn't hold a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the population, it might cause crackdowns or more violent, responses to opposition. Um, on the same side of that coin, low levels of trust also contribute to levels of violence. So in places, where grievances have accumulated between groups or between individuals and institutions, it can lead to this preemptive or retaliatory violence. And we consistently see this play a role in atrocities where actual or perceived grievances are commonly cited as kind of the lead up to mass atrocity. And then finally, I wanted to note that, violence becomes a more attractive option when individuals feel disempowered or marginalized or that they lack agency. And so agency is really about the connection that people have to their societies and whether they believe that they have the power to make a positive change or make any kind of change in their societies themselves. And so we see this factor in particular come into play a lot in context with violent extremist or non-state armed group activities in terms of, how does the feeling of being able to make a change in your environment affect your levels of support or your active involvement in levels of violence? And this also, goes, like I said, kind of quite hand in hand with legitimacy and trust as well. So this seems like quite a disheartening list of findings and tasks to set out with, but I actually don't think it's quite as bleak as it may seem. When we look at these characteristics of atrocity risk environments, we see these overlapping and compounding factors that, kind of build on each other and ultimately leave these communities vulnerable to atrocity. And what I find more heartening, or at least, a more positive side of that, right, is that, the peace building field has these proven tools that work to reduce these vulnerabilities, to repair relationships, to build trust, and to create mechanisms to manage conflicts nonviolently. And so these are all really essential components of atrocity prevention. So I wanted to highlight three of these opportunities that the review brought to the surface that changed the environment for atrocities in the various contexts that we considered. So the first is that the research showed that local individuals, groups, and structures that were trained and resourced to manage conflicts led to reductions in violence. They improved stability and they increased the number of conflicts managed nonviolently. And so we saw this kind of across the board from insider mediators in Yemen and peace ambassadors in South Sudan and truth tellers in Mali and early warning, early response networks in Nigeria and community information committees in Myanmar, and so it all looks different kind of depending on the location that you're implementing in. But what all these entities had in common was that they were tapped into the community dynamics. They held trust with the targeted communities. They provided structures to resolve conflicts, and they had this consistent support and resources over time. So it wasn't just kind of flying in and flying out about like how to resolve problems or what are, kind of some of the common issues that are happening in this particular place at this particular time. And so, what we saw across these contexts, though, was that that where these entities, these individuals, these groups were active and continuously kind of collecting and analyzing and responding to information around conflict issues, is that they were able to reduce violence and improve accountability, even in places with conflict. Just an example of this, right? In South Sudan, this looked like training community members from Magwe and Imale to monitor conflict data and trends for early warning in real time, collecting that information and sharing that with local peace committees and the right potential authorities to provide early responses to conflicts in their communities. And so, the way that the community and the members of these groups kind of responded is that they said, quote, it drastically reduced the road attacks on the Juba-Nibalé highway. It reduced cases of domestic violence and rape, and it reduced violence surrounding land issues as people return from IDP and refugee camps. And so all of these things in and of themselves are good things to reduce the occurrences of those. But these also were major trigger events for wider communal violence that, often is this kind of spiraling event or could be a trigger event for that can lead into mass atrocity. The second kind of opportunity here was that rapid response programs are most effective when they build on relationships and institutions that carry trust and legitimacy. So this really builds off of the first, but I do think it is distinct because we're talking about how important these individuals and institutions can be in reducing violence, but this takes time and it takes commitment for them to build trust with the communities they serve and to really demonstrate this track record of success. But what we saw as we reviewed all these programs, right, is that while they're critical for reducing the underlying violence affecting communities, which in and of itself is a risk factor for atrocities, they also were effective partners to deploy quickly when crisis hit or violence started to escalate because they already had this established relationship of trust and accountability with the communities. So to give a quick example of that, in Plateau State in Nigeria, donors supported the development of these kind of multi-level conflict monitoring and response platforms for more than 5 years across a variety of projects. And over that time period, 75% of those interventions reduced fatalities in their target locations. And I think interestingly, for an atrocity prevention audience, during that time frame, as levels of violence surged in 2018 and 2019 across the state, the local government areas, the LGAs, with these established peace architectures, they used them. They deployed that and trained individuals to de-escalate conflicts, to share information, to dispel rumors. And as a result, saw fewer instances of violence, even as their directly neighboring LGAs saw high levels of fatalities and violence. The third opportunity is just that bringing people together through collaboration, it reduces polarization and it improves social cohesion. So this was a really important finding to understand what avenues there are to drain the enabling environment for atrocities. And what we found is that restoring or establishing positive interactions between divided groups is crucial to atrocity prevention. So, for instance, in Central African Republic, the conflict between Seleka and anti-Balaka militias, it intensified religious divides between Muslims and Christians. And, it was to the point where, in the capital city of Bangui, they didn't feel safe entering into to interacting with members of the other faith community. So Muslims felt unsafe going to predominantly Christian areas, and Christians felt unsafe going to predominantly Muslim areas. And what this separation between the groups had was this, half of young people reported that they didn't think they had anything in common with members of the other faith community. So through some peace building programs to address this, they focused on restoring this common humanity and relationships between the groups and shifting the narratives of the other. And after a year, we really saw improvements in polarization. At the end of the year, 90% of young people were able, they identified shared values and reported they respected, people from the other faith background. And it also kind of reduced the inflammatory nature of conflict events. Whereas before it would kind of have days of these ripple effects, it actually kind of reduced the ripple from events that did still occur from the conflict. So just one last note on this is that what's so important about this is that as conflict intensifiers, you often see groups either forcibly or selectively isolate themselves from others, for safety because they are forced to. And what this does is it reinforces the harmful narratives, like I mentioned in the CAR example. I mean, it lets these negative interactions that are often full of tension, and it lets them dominate and dominate the narrative of the conflict and of the other group. So it's a really important part for us to be thinking about how these narratives come into play and how we can break down these social and physical barriers to interaction. So while these findings might not seem that groundbreaking to all of you, especially of those of you who implement programs and work in atrocity prevention, the implications of these findings do require change in our thinking and definitely a change in the way in which we do kind of the business of atrocity prevention. And so I'm actually really excited to have this conversation almost exactly on the 1 year anniversary of the release of the US strategy to anticipate, prevent, and mitigate atrocities. And for those of you who don't know this, it's the first ever interagency US strategy towards atrocity prevention. And it really takes a step forward in showing how the US government is thinking about prevention. So I'm really excited about it. And I think this research, actually, the implications of this research are quite helpful in accomplishing the goals that are set out in this strategy. So with that, I kind of wanted to share a few things for those of you who are working within the US government or outside of it to prevent atrocities, as a way to think about how this research applies to what you're doing. So the first is that we need to be thinking about atrocity prevention programming in times of relative stability. Establishing peace committees, shifting narratives, building trust, these all require long-term investment and programming cycles that go beyond, an 18 to 24 month cycle. And the rapid response programs to respond to opportunities or crises are critical. Those definitely play a very important role, but they work best when it can build on this foundation that's been built of trust and relationships and understanding of the dynamics and how to address them. So I think, we need to expand the horizon of how we're thinking about prevention and invest more in these structures and capacities for conflict management, during relative stability to have them pay off in times of crisis. The second it goes hand in hand again with the first, but we need to engage more and not less in times of crisis. So a historical approach to crisis moments in places like Afghanistan or Yemen or Myanmar or South Sudan, has been to restrict diplomatic engagement or introduce sanctions or drastically reduce non-humanitarian assistance, as a way to respond to behavior that is unwanted, or to respond to the fact that the context is unstable to work in. Precisely in these moments of upheaval that the risk for atrocity grows. And so it's really important to continue to engage. And so what does this really mean? It's ensuring that sanctions and other response mechanisms as a bare minimum don't preclude the ability for these local organizations or for these trusted actors to access resources and support. It's about building on those relationships and supporting them where possible. And I think this is something that I've heard quite a lot in the work that I've done, where somebody in the embassy or the mission or will say, well, that's great. We want to do that, but we don't know who these people are. Can you tell us? Can you connect us? Which is fine. But I think also if we are talking about rapid response and we're trying to talk about how we can better support these actors who are able to de-escalate conflicts and do this kind of frontline prevention work, we need to start incorporating that into the job descriptions and the mandate of the embassy to understand who those people are, where do those relationships lie, and who are those trusted individuals that we can go to understand what are the dynamics and what can we do in these kind of uh, moments of crisis. And then third, I know I've spoken for a very long time, so I'll go very quickly, but it's really just around having more events like this. And I really mean that in terms of like sharing lessons learned and breaking down the silos of atrocity prevention and how we talk about it is really important. Because so often we get bogged down in the fact that atrocities are so personally and diplomatically and programmatically sensitive that we let this prevent us from sharing our experiences. And so, I think there are lots of opportunities for us to get creative, both in terms of how we share the really important nuggets of information of what we've learned through programming, or, how does the lessons learned of the past help us to apply to, situations that we're facing right now. And I think it also is about kind of, integration of atrocity prevention into all of our assistance is important, but I think a specific aspect of that is in these high risk atrocity environments is building in this flexibility and these crisis modifiers, right, to allow this shift that's needed to kind of adapt to changing conflict dynamics, in real time, to make sure that we're taking opportunity at these moments to best support those who need it. So I'm going to stop there because I've definitely gone over my allotted time, but I really look forward to hearing your thoughts, Kim, and definitely really interested in Q&A with everybody else who's joined us. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for that great presentation, for all the research that you guys have done, for all the work that's happened on atrocity prevention under this award and just more broadly. I've never been an expert listener before in an event, so that's a new title that I'm gonna add a bullet point on my CV on that one. But thanks for having me. For folks I haven't met, I'm Kim Hart. I'm a senior human rights advisor at USAID. I'm also one of the USAID representatives on the Interagency Atrocity Prevention Task Force. And so I'm really excited to see this kind of research coming out on atrocity prevention and what we can be doing. Just super quick, because the real value of this conversation is also going to get into the questions and answers. I don't want to take too much time. But one of the things I just so appreciated about your paper, Katie, and what you just presented is just, and I think what you've really highlighted today is that there are risk factors, for example, social cohesion or lack thereof. There are warning signs, and we can do work on those that can help us do prevention. And this is like something that USAID has really been advocating for within our own agency, within the interagency, outside of the US government, is that we really, really need to focus on prevention. Prevention is where we have the tools. Prevention is where we can have the biggest impact. And we know the warning signs and risk factors. We just have to take action. So I just want to appreciate what you said there. And especially what you said about kind of thinking about atrocity prevention during times of stability. And I think this is so critical. One of the questions we get all the time is like, well, what does an atrocity prevention program look like for USAID? And in reality, most of the time, it doesn't look like an atrocity prevention program. It looks like a conflict program or an elections program or a service provision program, because those are the risk factors, right? Like those are what create divides and create vulnerabilities. One of the things that we're trying to do at USAID is increase our utility of atrocity risk assessments and integrate those lines of inquiry into our violence and conflict assessments that we do more broadly. Because it's really easy after the fact when an atrocity is happening or has happened to say, well, if we had just done XYZ, or actually the core problem was tensions between these two groups. If we can actually understand the problem set earlier, then we know what to do about it. And so the baseline is we need better data, we need better analysis. So I'm here to ask everyone on this call, please share your analysis with us because we need it. But also it's on us as the government to have those lines of inquiry. And then we can say, okay, are we doing enough? What does that look like? And then just the last thing I want to highlight about the paper that I think is incredibly important is this point on staying engaged. I think this is Kim's opinion. This is not a formal USA talking point, but I would say, it's really hard for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of different factors that go into play. And I think it's also bureaucracies are inherently risk averse. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking within the DRG Center at USAID and more broadly about how do we let our partners determine the risks that they're comfortable with. So instead of us as a donor saying it's too high risk for you to do XYZ, us asking, what is your risk analysis? What do you think this is possible? What are you comfortable with and how can we support you? And really trying to meet our partners and local actors where they are instead of determining it ourselves. And then really focusing on adaptive management and flexibility like Katie was talking about so that we don't have to, when an atrocity, takes place or when we see these material changes in environments, create a whole new procurement that's going to take a year to design at USAID. But how can we adapt the programs we have to respond to the problems that we're seeing? And that way we can be responding in real time. So I just want to appreciate those points that you made because I think they're really critical to how we're thinking about this issue. And to be clear, we have a long way to go. And so I'm relying on everyone on this call to tell us how to do it better. And I couldn't agree more with Katie on the point of sharing because you guys are out there, you're doing the work, you're talking to people, you have insights. We're in the USG bubble. So we're doing our best over here, but the partnership is absolutely critical. So I'll stop there in kind of remarks, but maybe I'll just add a question. Can I start with the first question? Is that allowed? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more. I mean, like one of the things that I get questions about a lot within our own agency is like, well, isn't atrocity prevention just conflict prevention or just violence prevention? And absolutely, there's significant overlap. But I think like one of the big things that we see as differences is around like the systematic component of atrocities, where we're seeing things that are like directed. And, we're really seeing an approach that cuts across multiple different communities or multiple different occurrences or things like that, where we're seeing kind of a bigger, more systematic problem. And I'd be curious from the research that you did, you talked about social cohesion and trust building as really critical. And I'm curious if like the people that you interviewed or the cases that you looked at showed that work built a resilience against manipulation, not manipulation is the right word, but either manipulation or participation in kind of bigger incidents of violence that amount to atrocities. So when my intercommunal tensions become part of a mass atrocity, like, am I more resilient if I participate in the kind of work that you talked about? Sorry, that wasn't a very articulate question, but I'd be curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that, Kim. I appreciate kind of your thoughts coming from the USG perspective on this. And I think, yeah, I agree with you in terms of kind of the overlaps in terms of a lot of it, in terms of when we're looking at these kind of core drivers of conflict and atrocities. Like I mentioned, this report, really looked at cases that had these links to the wider social dynamics, right? So that the social dynamics of atrocity did play a part in the social dynamics of the conflict. So there are obviously cases of atrocities that won't fall into the purview of what we looked at that will have different dynamics. But I think what you said is like, yes, in a certain place, like, right, like when what came to mind first was the kind of this piece of evidence from Mali, where it was saying, right, that people who knew someone who was the victim of an attack from, a government agency, like security agency or police or whomever, they were much more likely to support violence later on, right? And so when we talk about trust and legitimacy and resilience, it's really about looking at all of these overlapping different relationships and how they manifest and how they compound each other. And so, when we can start to, like I said in the CAR example, right? There's these narratives that build up based on, real facts of the conflict, right? There was, real divisions between kind of, some of the groups being more predominantly Muslim and predominantly Christian and victims kind of falling along these lines. But how those play out in terms of like how it's covered in the media or how it's shared between your friends do you have pre-existing trust in the institutions that provide accountability for crimes? Like all of these things play a role in terms of how big the ball gets, right? How big the conflict ball, the snowball gets that can often lead into kind of then just a trigger moment, a moment of upheaval, a moment of conflict that can then trigger this more widespread violence. And so I think, yes, there's a need to have a conflict prevention lens going into all kinds of atrocity prevention. That's why it's so important to extend this kind of prevention timeline. But I think, there's also these specific moments in time where we're like, hey, like the rumors are building. There's an election and it's going to be incredibly contentious because no one believes that the current, government is legitimate or that the elections are going to be rigged. So we know that there's going to be a lot of tension where these pre-existing factors come to play. That's where those moments where you can build on these relationships of trust, these institutions that are showing ways to de-escalate those issues. That's when that atrocity prevention in that form comes into. And so it's not that we have to come up with a whole different tool book necessarily, but it's about how we deploy it and in what, kind of what moments and like how we focus our analysis and our response.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Kim, for a really great first question and also for serving as our expert listener today. I'm going to combine to the questions in the chat as people think as well. We have questions from East Africa and West Africa, both asking a very similar question about sort of the role of government and government structures to create early warning, early response frameworks for atrocity prevention. Sort of what can sort of CSOs, community organizations do when those sort of national level structures are working?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And I think I have a couple of different answers to it. I think the first and foremost is, government is not homogeneous structure, right? And so I think when we say the government isn't working to do this, or these institutions aren't working, or these aspects of the government, right, aren't working, it really is important for us to really disentangle that quite a bit more and say, well, is it the national level or is it state level? Is it at the local level? Like, where are there opportunities? Where are there people who are doing this work to try, whether it's accountability and justice, whether it's, kind of the Ministry of Information or what have you, Ministry of Education, like where are there these people and these parts of the government that are working and are functioning and are trying to, serve their communities. And so I think that's like a first and foremost thing that, let's not paint with a broad brush here, especially when it comes to atrocities, right? We need to be very particular about what we're talking about and where we're talking about it. So I think the first is to really just identify who are your champions within a heterogeneous government. And I think you'll find that actually, if you look at it with that lens, you will find a lot of people who are trying to do their job well, who want to get better at their job and are looking for technical assistance or or resources to kind of accomplish what they're setting out to do. I think the second component of that, is that when we're looking at civil society structures, and I didn't get into this level of detail, but it says in the report, these weren't just civil society structures that were happening on their own, right? Like they were very much linked to, kind of when there's peace dialogues and these committees. I'm thinking specifically in Nigeria, for instance, it was about kind of bringing together both these local influencers who didn't necessarily play a formal role with representatives of the security forces, of local representatives, of, kind of people who are working at the local health clinics and things like that about, how do we collectively bring together our knowledge and what we're understanding about the dynamics of the community and who is best placed to respond, right? Like who has those relationships, who is able to kind of relationships and the authorities to respond. And so I think it's also about making sure that we're not creating parallel processes here. It's about, how can we involve and make this a holistic response? And I think another interesting component of this Nigeria work is that, once you start to build this track record of success, right, and being able to demonstrate that it's anticipating or responding to conflicts and that it benefits the community, right? There is interest from government to adopt that, right? And bring it in and start to see how can we integrate this, as an agency within the government to make sure that we have this capacity going forward. So those are just two kind of examples, but ones that I think are really important to consider, making sure that we're not painting with a broad brush, and then also that we're not leaving any of them and leaving, kind of government pressure out of it.
Thank you for that. And thank you for our question askers for asking a very similar question from different contexts, which I think underscores the point you made in your presentation about the importance of sharing our knowledge on this, sharing our insights. I've been going through the attendee list. We have experts from just about every region that the report covers. So I'll add in a quick plug for organizations or people or individuals, academics who have created resources on this topic or similar topics to share them on ConnexUs that we can share out everyone else on the call here, along with Katie's report, to sort of continue this knowledge sharing from context to context. Hector, you have a question. If you want to unmute and ask it.
Hi, yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Katie, for the really interesting presentations. And yeah, I was wondering because with the threat that climate change presents and how it exacerbates very brutal conflicts and also the link with food price protests, etc. Do you have any insights or learnings on early warning systems that integrate like these both variables, like climate-related variables and conflict prevention?
Thanks. Yeah. So I think in terms of so let me reframe your question. So you're asking about kind of were there cases where like these early warning, early response systems, like also were looking towards kind of climate challenges and looking at ways to respond on that. Is that right?
Yeah, right. Or
Okay.
because there are some like regional structures that have early warning systems for climate variables, but they are not integrated or coordinated with conflict prevention sometimes.
Yeah. So I don't know specifically about the climate ones, but I think, what I would say is that, the purpose and like the value of a lot of these structures, whether it's individuals that are trained, whether it's groups or institutions, is that they're collecting the the dynamics that are relevant to the communities that they're involved with. Right. And so in some cases, that is things that are related to natural resources or, around kind of changes, kind of the ramifications of climate change, and so I think, where it comes into play, I think and I do think there is a lot of value of bringing that in, right? Because we're seeing increasingly that, conflict and climate are so intertwined that there's a lot that can be learned from what's being collected at this local kind of peace structure level. And so I think this also is something that I think is important, not only for the climate community, but also like how do we take all of this analysis, all this data that we have from these individuals and start to communicate it to these structures that are making these kind of larger decisions around things like climate or conflict. So I don't have a specific example of like, oh, there was this one, I know, for instance, there's lots of, farmer-herder conflicts and natural resource conflicts have played quite a big role in a lot of the different projects that we looked at. But in terms of kind of connecting it to like the larger climate agenda, I didn't come up in the research.
Great. Thanks, Katie. And thanks, Hector. Good question from Sajid. The question was about, and this might be a Kim question as well, sort of the process for U.S. government prioritization of countries to monitor early warning signs of potential atrocities. Then sort of a follow-up question on that is, how can CSOs or people in communities that don't see their country or their context prioritized, and what are the avenues to sort of wave the flag on early signs?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. It's a great question because often it's like hard for people outside the government to tell what the heck's going on inside the government, which is totally fair. Sometimes I feel that way and I'm inside the government. It's a really, really important question. So I would say there's a few different things, and every agency is a little bit different. But in terms of how the interagency, which is like the whole of the US government, kind of approaches the monitoring question. So our intelligence colleagues do an annual atrocity risk assessment where they're looking all over the world at a series of different risk factors, and they produce a classified document for those of us in the government to understand, which countries are at particular risk and what that looks like. And they kind of rank the different types of risks. So that's a really core resource for us. We also relied quite a bit on the U.S. Holocaust Museum's Early Warning Project rankings, which are incredibly helpful. That's a statistical analysis. In addition, colleagues at the State Department's Conflict Stabilization and Operations Bureau, sure. It's okay, but I was like, gotta say office for a second. They also compiled basically like a top 30 at-risk list that uses kind of these two resources plus their analytics overlaid on top of it. And for countries that are in the top 30 risk category, it triggers some certain requirements, legal requirements for the US government. For example, to consider atrocity prevention when we're doing our long-term strategies for the State Department for USAID. It triggers training requirements for foreign service officers. For those countries that aren't in the top 30 list, it's a little bit more of, each embassy and each mission and different parts of the US government thinking about how to engage and what that looks like. In terms of less like formal rankings, I would also say, from a USAID perspective, like I was saying earlier, we do violence and conflict assessments. We have a lot of programs that relate on these issues. We're working to add more kind of context monitoring indicators into our program so that we're getting information from our implementing partners about where they're seeing risk factors as well. And then within each embassy, of course, like the political officers in the embassy are tracking this too. So there's a lot of different ways we're tracking it. It's an art, not a science. We're absolutely not doing it perfectly. I don't think anyone is. In addition, we also work with the International Atrocity Prevention Working Group, which is a group of a variety of governments that come together. And we also share kind of priorities and warning signs and things at an international level. But all that's to say, that's really important and we're trying really hard, but we need to hear from you all, especially if you're feeling like your country's not being elevated. One of the things we're trying to do with the Atrocity Prevention Task Force, which has historically been very responsive, right? Like, of course, the US government's going to look at atrocity response and prevention in a place like Sudan or Ukraine or Burma because it's right there in front of us and we see it happening. What we've been trying to do is identify 2 to 3 prevention priority countries at any given time for the task force to really focus on where we're seeing some concerning signs, but we feel like we have more lead up time before an atrocity might happen. So right now, we're working on 3 priority prevention countries. We're also in a process right now of assessing future priority prevention countries. Obviously, that list is small. That doesn't mean that represents the entirety of what the US government's doing. It just means what the interagency is coordinating on and really working heavily on together. Within USAID, we're also doing kind of prevention work in a wide range of countries, some that you might expect and some that you probably wouldn't. But we've been talking a lot about those countries that fall like in the 30 to 60 range of the rankings. Those countries where like we're seeing significant enough signs that they're at the top half of the risk factors, but they're not acute, we don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, as like a really key place for US government support. And to your question of what can you do to share information with us? So Xander has my email. I told him, please feel free to drop it in the chat box. There's a number of us who work on atrocity prevention within the government. And at any time, please, 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 we would love to hear from you about any risk factors you're seeing or anything you're concerned about. If you're based in a particular country, there are colleagues in the embassy who work on these things too. And so if you have relationships at the embassy, you can always go to them. You don't have to come to us. But all that's to say, we don't want anyone to feel limited. Like I can only talk to the embassy or I can only talk to the DC people. There's lots of people. So feel free to ping me anytime. If you have colleagues who work at DRL, at the State Department or in the embassy, like anybody, basically, I think if you flag it to any of us, we'll try and elevate it. And I can give an example of a country. I can't say the country, but where recently an implementing partner came to us and said, we're really, really concerned about this country and this rhetoric that we're hearing of hate speech that has really escalated to the point that it could trigger atrocities. They said that to USAID in the mission. The mission elevated it to us here in DC, the atrocity prevention folks. We then elevated it to the interagency. We got a briefing from the intelligence community. And we've had several interagency conversations and are now doing a formal atrocity risk assessment that all came from one partner telling us about something that we might not have heard otherwise. So I know it feels like a big bureaucracy, a big black hole, but there's a group of people who sincerely want to work on this issue, and anything you say to us, we will take very seriously and really want to engage. So appreciate anything you can share. Hopefully that adds a little clarity. It's not a clear system. But yeah, we would love, love, love any kind of information that you can share with us about the risks that you're seeing.
Thanks, Kim. Katie, do you have anything to add? If not, I'll go to one more question before we wrap up. The question is about the role of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms within the atrocity prevention space. And I promise not to go beyond the scope of your paper, but I'm very curious about this.
So you said the role of, sorry, can you repeat that?
Traditional conflict resolution mechanisms within the atrocity prevention ecosystem.
When you say traditional, do you mean like kind of non-statutory, like outside the government, or like
Or
kind of the
non-Western
tried and
methods.
true?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's really the core of what a lot of this research was on, right? Was like, how can we build off what already works, in a particular place? And so, it's not about it's not about building an institution for an institution's sake. It's not about, kind of operating it's not about going in with an agenda to say this is where beyond like we want to build the capacities to identify, monitor, and respond to conflicts and risk factors. I also think that when we look at who are some of the most effective actors, it's not just, it's very rarely, honestly, state actors, but you see a lot of traditional chiefs or leaders. You see a lot of youth actors. You see a lot of religious actors, who are really the people that hold the most influence in the way kind of people interact with the world around them. And so I think, really coming at this from a perspective of, how do we build on that trust and legitimacy that already exists, to try and create more healthy and safe and just communities. That's really the intention. And so I think that, I'm trying to think of a good example from the research off the top of my head, on this, but I think, that's it's often I think the religious component of this too, I think is also really in use because they're often just not traditionally included in a lot of different programs. And so I think going in with kind of a lens of like, how do we build off of the capacities, and what works within these communities is really important. Yeah, I'm not sure I really gave a great answer to that, but I do think, I think it's incredibly valuable, and I think that the ways that we can marry up both like conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and integrate that into, kind of an overarching approach around like, how do we build up the foundation and architecture of people across the countries that are able and willing to respond to conflicts, the better. And I think that's just kind of the key aspect of this.
Thank you, Katie. And keeping an eye on the time, we have a couple of really good questions that I think we're going to push to ConnexUs discussion forums. So we'll create a link for that and send it out. Kim shared her email. Katie, you don't have to answer on camera. We can share your email, but feel free to contact us. Perfect. Contact us to follow up with the speakers. But Katie and Kim, I want to thank you both and give you a chance for any sort of last words, one thing to take home. Give it the last word.
Nothing for me. Over to Katie. She's the author, but thanks for having me today and looking forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, no, this has been a really great conversation. I'm really happy to have Kim here, and thanks for hosting on Xander. I think the main thing that, I'd like to say is please continue to share and continue to, give us your own experiences around this, because I know that everyone in this community that I've talked to it craves more information and craves more experiences. And I think it's such a hard topic to do knowledge sharing well. And so just an open invitation to really, we want to dive into this. It's something we're really committed to and personally really, feel very passionately about. So just a big thank you for letting us use the platform and for starting this conversation. And I hope we can continue to do so over, the future. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie and Kim, and for all of you for being here. Our next ConnexUs Thursday talk is on the 27th of July, 2 weeks from today, on building social cohesion in online communities. So be sure to register for that. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks again, everyone.